The conventional narrative, sedimented through centuries of historical revisionism and cultural dogmatism, has systematically reduced the figure of Sophia to a mere mythological ornament, a poetic symbol of wisdom, or a forgotten goddess, confined amidst the dust of lost temples and indecipherable scrolls. However, a rigorous Gnostic analysis reveals that such oblivion is not the fruit of the natural erosion of time, but the outcome of an intentional design of concealment. In the underground esoteric tradition, Sophia was never conceived as a static myth, but as a dynamic event of cyclical return, a cosmological force that does not await a future prophesied in distant eras, but which manifests as an ontological urgency in the immediate present. The ancient initiates did not describe her return as a pyrotechnic spectacle in the exterior skies, but as a phenomenon of radical imminence, an emergence of wisdom that flourishes primarily within human consciousness. It is probable that you have already perceived the tremors of this activation, that ineffable sensation that the established order of reality is about to change, a visceral perception that, while the external world slides into entropic chaos, something ancient is breaking free internally, preparing for a great revelation. What makes this perspective even more penetrating is the existence of apocryphal teachings, excluded from the official canon, which suggest a direct correlation between external chaos and an internal metamorphosis of humanity. We are not facing a modern prophecy or a calendar dating, but the observation of precise spiritual conditions, described through the universal language of symbols. When the eye of the observer opens, these signals become omnipresent, manifesting especially in that silent traction which the soul exercises upon the personality, pushing it towards unexplored depths without an apparent logical reason. Sophia, in this cosmology, is not an entity who arrives to save passively, but represents the restoration of the divine feminine principle, the missing piece necessary for the integration of the solar logos. Her return marks the entry into an era that transcends the manipulation of lower forces, known as archons, and does not occur with delicacy. She bursts in like light into a room sealed to induce sleep, pitilessly exposing everything that depends on darkness to survive. Leave us like, followed by a hype, the signal of vibrant resonance, here, now, as a seal of the fact that you are deliberately activating your perception beyond the veil of illusion. Perform this gesture because you recognize, in the abyss of your interiority, that the time of lethargy is definitively concluded and that your consciousness, now awake, imperiously demands the nourishment of integral truth. To decipher these signals, a deeper structural understanding of human spiritual history is indispensable. Hegemonic institutions have not limited themselves to burying Sophia. They have also reconfigured the figure of the enlightened master, presenting him in forms distant from his essence as a revealer of maps for liberation. In the original Gnostic vision, the intent was not to found religions, but to protect a gnosis, direct knowledge, that no hierarchy could contain. The kingdom is not a physical or temporal place, but an omnipresent state of consciousness, accessible through inner recognition. Sophia appears constantly in these texts not as a marginal figure, but as the cosmic intelligence woven into the very fabric of liberation. She represents intuitive wisdom, that aspect of knowing which does not derive from linear logic but from instantaneous recognition. Her story begins with a descent, an audacious attempt to know the unknowable beyond the harmony of the pleroma, the fullness, an act that triggered the fracture from which the material world governed by the demiurge was born. However, the Gnostics did not interpret this as an irreversible tragedy, but as a prophecy in stages: fall, fragmentation, oblivion, and finally, the inevitable return. The connection between the solar principle, the logos, and Sophia becomes impossible to ignore in Gnostic cosmology. They are not separate entities, but counterparts of a sacred syzygy, two currents of the same work of restoration. If the logos is the divine light that awakens vision, Sophia is the divine wisdom that awakens understanding. One reveals the illusory nature of the prison, the other points to the exit door. History has attempted to erase this layer because it confers immense power upon the individual. If humanity understood that the divine spark is intrinsic and that awakening does not require intermediaries, control based on fear would collapse. Consequently, the divine feminine has been reduced to silence or associated with error, but Sophia has never disappeared. She has taken refuge in the symbolic underground, becoming that silent pressure you feel when the world appears noisy but empty. Now, as the cosmic cycle draws to a close, the question is not whether Sophia is real, but how to recognize the symptoms of her re-emergence in the structure of your consciousness. It is crucial to understand that the opposition to Sophia's awakening is not accidental, but systemic, operated by what ancient texts define as antimamen pneuma, or counterfeiting spirit. This force does not create, but imitates, constructing a labyrinth of echoes designed to distort the call of the soul. Let us reflect on the parable of the city of mute bells. It is told of a metropolis where, for millennia, bells rang not to mark time, but to cover the heartbeat of the inhabitants. The architects of the city knew that if the noise were to cease for even a single instant, men would hear a melody coming from the underground, an ancient song capable of making the walls crumble. Sophia is that sudden silence between one toll and another. She is the unauthorized interval in which man notices that the noise is artificial. The return of wisdom acts as a frequency deactivator. She dismantles the archontic mimesis, that is, the system's ability to convince you that your anxiety, your competition, and your fear were natural. When Sophia emerges, she does not bring peace in the conventional sense, but epinoia, the luminous imagination that allows you to visualize an exit where logic sees only impassable walls. The first unequivocal sign of wisdom's return manifests as a violent allergy of the soul towards superficiality. It is not a matter of intellectual snobbery, but of a vibratory saturation. The inner being can no longer feed on simulacra. Let us consider the parable of the wax banquet. It is told of a nobleman who, for his entire life, participated in sumptuous banquets where the dishes were splendidly carved in colored wax. The guests, in a state of collective hypnosis, pretended to eat, praising the flavor of non-existent foods. One day, a ray of pure sun, that is Sophia, struck the nobleman's eyes, awakening him from the trance. Suddenly, the sight of his dining companions biting into the wax became intolerable, nauseating for him. He could no longer feign satiety where there was only empty form. This is what happens when Sophia activates. Banal conversations, relationships of convenience, and works devoid of purpose become unbearable. Your tolerance towards falsehood drops to zero, because the part of you that is eternal can no longer sustain the performance in the theater of the ephemeral. The second sign is the transmutation of desire. Meaning becomes preeminent over pleasure. The archontic world is designed to keep you in a perpetual cycle of sensory stimulation, because the pursuit of external pleasure makes you controllable. When Sophia awakens, a hunger of a different nature arises, a thirst for truth, depth, and real presence. Let us imagine the parable of the merchant of mirrors. A man spent his life collecting mirrors that reflected his embellished image, believing that happiness resided in those reflections. One day, he found a window open to the true starry sky. The vastness and mystery of the cosmic abyss, meaning, struck him with such intensity that the act of looking at himself in the mirrors, the pleasure of the ego, suddenly seemed futile to him. He shattered the mirrors not out of anger, but to free the space necessary to contemplate the infinite. This hunger for meaning becomes stronger than ambition or the need for social approval. You no longer seek distraction, but resonance. You no longer want to be entertained, you want to be transformed. The third sign, often the most disorienting, is the collapse of old identities. Sophia does not return to preserve your old self, but to restore the true self, and this process invariably requires a dismantling. Let us reflect on the parable of the living armor, a warrior wore armor that, over time, had fused with his skin, so much so that he forgot where the metal ended and the flesh began. When wisdom began to flow in his veins, his body of light expanded, pressing against the rigid metal, and the armor began to crack painfully. The warrior, terrified, thought he was dying, not understanding that death was in reality the birth of his free form. Feeling disoriented, as if the roles you have played for years no longer belong to you, is not a symptom of psychological crisis, but of spiritual correction. It is the painful but necessary removal of the masks that were suffocating your divine spark. The fourth sign represents the point of no return, the cessation of the fear of losing the false life. This stage marks the moment when the prison loses its gravitational grip. It is the understanding that the security offered by the system is an illusion and that truth, however uncertain, is the only real refuge. Let us meditate on the parable of the ship in the desert. A crew lived on a ship stranded in the middle of an infinite desert, convinced by the captain that beyond the dunes lay an ocean, though never seen. They spent their days polishing the brass and repairing the sails, terrified at the idea of abandoning the ship, their only security. When Sophia's voice whispered in the wind, some sailors understood the absurdity of their condition. They descended from the ship and began to walk into the desert, discovering that the sand was only a mirage and that, with every step of courage, the earth blossomed beneath their feet. When you stop bargaining with illusion, when you are willing to lose everything that is false in order to embody what is true, Sophia takes full possession of your vessel. But there is a further level of understanding, often omitted even in the boldest treatises, which concerns the biology of liberation itself. The return of Sophia is not a mere intellectual paradigm shift, but a true cellular transubstantiation. The human body, in the deep Gnostic vision, is not a definitive prison, but an alchemical crucible. It is the place where the density of matter must be spiritualized through conscious presence. Let us think of the parable of the potter and the luminous clay. A potter worked a dark and heavy clay, complaining of its opacity. But he did not know that inside every grain of that earth, a microscopic star was trapped. When he began to shape the vase not with the force of his hands, but with the warmth of his vital breath, the clay did not change shape, but changed nature, becoming transparent like crystal. Thus Sophia operates in your body. When you stop resisting the truth, your biological structure begins to vibrate at a frequency that the archons cannot parasitize. Chronic fatigue, inexplicable pains, the nocturnal vibrations that many feel, are often the symptoms of this recalibration. The flesh is learning to sustain a voltage of light for which it was not programmed by the control system, but for which it was destined by the origin. The integration of this wisdom is not theoretical, but practical and vibratory. Sophia requires cooperation, which begins with the creation of pockets of absolute silence. Not complex meditations, but empty spaces where the question, "What is true right now?" can resonate without intellectual interference, followed by the exercise of ruthless discernment, identifying where you are performing instead of being. Finally, the inner union between light, vision, and wisdom, understanding. Faced with chaos, do not ask only what to do, but what you are ignoring, that is, Sophia, and what the honest next step is, the logos. Practicing this coherence, external reality will begin to reorganize itself around your new frequency. Synchronicities will increase not by chance, but because your biology is becoming a conductor for a higher intelligence. The false world does not end with an external apocalypse, but ceases to exist for you through energetic non-participation. It is with profound gratitude that I acknowledge your courage in confronting these ancestral truths, and to seal this pact of awakening and anchor the frequency of wisdom in your daily reality, I invite you to perform an act of conscious will. Leave a like on this content as a sign of assent to the truth. Subscribe to the channel so as not to lose the golden thread of gnosis that we are weaving together week after week. And finally, comment down below with the key phrase, "I am the vessel of living wisdom," accompanied by a thank you to your own soul for having guided you here. May the light of the logos illuminate your path, and the wisdom of Sophia guard your heart, so that you may walk as sovereigns in a world that is about to be reborn. See you soon.